The house did not look like a secret. It sat on the corner like any other old Victorian that had survived too many paint jobs and not enough repairs. Faded blue siding, white trim peeling at the edges, a porch that leaned a little to one side the way people did when they were tired. The big maple out front dropped leaves into everyone's gutters every fall. The mail slot stuck. The steps creaked. For years, the neighbors had passed it without thinking much about it. Old Mr. Ward's place. The one with the jazz records and the overgrown roses. The house that still smelled like vinyl and furniture polish even when the windows were open. On paper, on the deed in a county drawer, it was something else. It was one of the few houses on the block that a black man had managed to buy outright in the 70s, when banks were still quietly drawing invisible red lines on maps. It was the place where he had slipped cash into envelopes instead of trusting loan officers who smiled with their mouths and not their eyes. It was the one property nobody had been able to pry out of his hands with a bad appraisal, a balloon payment, or a too-good-to-be-true offer. And, as of the morning this story really begins, it belonged to two sisters who did not fit the neighborhood's idea of what family was supposed to look like. The older one was black. The younger one was white. If you looked at them from far away, you might not have seen it. Two women unloading boxes from the same rental truck, moving at the same tired rhythm, laughing at the same stupid jokes only siblings seemed to find funny. But up close, the genetic math showed. Different mothers, same father. In any other neighborhood, that would have been a detail, a piece of trivia tucked between recipes and birthdays. On a block that was still congratulating itself on how much better it had become since back in the day, it became a question, then a whisper, then a fault line. Their names were Lena and Hannah. Lena was 38, with skin the color of coffee with just enough cream, hair in tight coils she pulled back in a puff when she worked, and a way of walking that said she knew what rooms she belonged in, even when the people inside did not. She was the one who had grown up in the house. She knew every creak and draft by heart. Hannah was 28, pale with freckles, loose brown hair she always forgot to tie up, and a grin that arrived a half-second too early or too late, depending on how nervous she was. She had never lived in the house. She had visited as a child on awkward weekends and carefully scheduled holidays, staying on the pull-out couch while adult voices argued in rooms with closed doors. The will had not cared about any of that. Their father had written both names in the same ink, side by side, with language that left no room for interpretation. The house belonged to them jointly. The land under it, too. The mortgage had been paid off years before. What they did with it after the funeral, he had told them, was their choice. For a little while, in the aftershock of grief, that choice felt simple. They would keep it, fix the roof, scrape and repaint the trim, turn the front room into a home office so they could both work remotely a few days a week, split the property taxes and the utility bills and the 1,000 small tasks that came with old wood and old pipes. They would give the house another life instead of letting it become a staging ground for someone else's flip. Lena already lived in the city. She would move back in. Hannah would leave the bland apartment she shared with 2 roommates across town and take the second bedroom upstairs, the one with the slanted ceiling and the window that faced the maple tree. For the first time, they would live under the same roof as adults. It felt, in those early weeks, like a small rebellion, against the way the world had drawn lines through their lives. They had grown up on opposite sides of town, with holidays negotiated like treaties and introductions that stumbled. "This is your sister," adults said, like they were reading the label on a stranger's suitcase. Now they were dragging furniture over hardwood together, arguing about paint colors, discovering that they both hated beige with an intensity that made them laugh. The house seemed to like it. Floorboards warmed. The kitchen filled with the smell of real food instead of reheated leftovers. Their father's old stereo, revived, sent jazz and neo-soul into corners that had been quiet too long. If the story ended there, it would be tidy. Family finds a way. Old house, new beginning. But the block had been changing long before the sisters moved in, and change had not come quietly. It had arrived in stages, first as a coffee shop that put "Third Wave" on its chalkboard sign, then as metal straws in mason jars, then as dogs with Instagram accounts and strollers that looked more expensive than some cars on the street. The people moving in told themselves they were revitalizing the neighborhood. They used words like potential and up and coming, while ignoring the stories that clung to the bricks like soot. They did not think of themselves as part of a wave. Waves, after all, are what wash things away. Officially, there was no homeowners association. The houses were too old. The lots platted long before HOAs became a standard tool for policing grass length and human behavior. Unofficially, a group of long-term gentrifiers had begun behaving like one. They called themselves the Neighborhood Improvement Council. On flyers and in emails, they were NIC, a harmless acronym that hid a much sharper instinct, the need to control everything within sight lines. They organized beautification days that somehow never reach the last few stubborn rental properties. They wrote kind reminders about trash cans and porch furniture that never seemed to land on certain porches. They used the word community often enough that the ones who had been here before they arrived started to hear it as a threat. When news of the inheritance hit the grapevine, it arrived stripped of context. The man on the corner had died, people said. His house was going to the daughters. Some remembered Lena, the black girl who had grown up there, now a woman. Others were surprised to hear that there was also a white daughter. They had never seen her. The story, or rather, the pieces of stories, collided in people's heads. Then came the image that fixed everything in place. Two women, one black and one white, sitting together on the porch steps, feet side by side on the cracked concrete, laughing over something on a phone, while moving boxes waited behind them. No one on the NIC mailing list said anything ugly out loud. They did not need to. Their emails began with phrases like property values and historic character. They wondered in carefully coded language what joint ownership would mean for stability. Someone mentioned potential tenant situations. Someone else worried about future subdivision. It all sounded technical on the screen. Underneath, it meant something simpler. They did not like what it looked like when the house on the corner refused to fit neatly into their idea of who belonged here. The first strike didn't feel like a strike. It arrived as a letter in the mail slot, printed on nicey letterhead, folded neatly into thirds. The tone was friendly, almost cheerful. A welcome to the neighborhood note, complete with suggestions about the best bakery, the best dog walker, the best lawn service. Somewhere in the middle, between recommendations for recycling pickup and a list of approved paint colors for historic harmony, a paragraph slid in like a knife. The council, it said, encouraged new owners to clarify primary ownership for the sake of zoning considerations and future planning. If there were co-owners, it recommended formalizing roles to avoid confusion. It read like advice. It felt like a warning. Lena read it standing at the kitchen counter, coffee cooling untouched. Hannah leaned over her shoulder, eyes moving faster than her brain, irritation rising. They both recognized the impulse in the text. Pick one of you to be the real owner, the one we can deal with. The rest is noise. For the NIC, that one had already been picked in their heads. It was the sister whose skin tone would not make the block look, as one member later put it in an email, he never expected anyone outside the chain to see, like it sliding backward. The second strike came in person. A woman with hard Pilates arms and a soft voice knocked on the door one afternoon with a welcome basket of organic jam and a stack of forms. She introduced herself as the NIC chair. Her smile was almost too bright to look at directly. The forms, she explained, were purely informational. Household details, emergency contacts, preferred email. The last page asked, in neat boxes, for primary owner, for neighborhood records, and secondary resident, S. She said it was just for communication. She did not say why her eyes flicked toward Hannah each time she said owner, or why her tone warmed when Hannah answered questions about work and cooled by a few degrees when Lena mentioned hers. The sisters did not fill out the forms that day. Instead, they put them on the fridge with a magnet, where they sat like a piece of junk mail that had somehow been promoted. The third strike came with a noise complaint. Lena loved music the way some people loved oxygen. She worked from home some days, designing curriculum, editing documents, answering emails. Jazz in the background helped her brain find rhythm in the monotony. She played it at a level normal voices could talk over. The NIC's complaint, filed with the city and CC'd to every address on the block, described constant loud music and party-level noise at all hours. It mentioned bass thumping and disruption. It did not mention that the music was Coltrane at 2 p.m. A polite officer knocked on the door one weekday, more embarrassed than angry. The call notes on his screen did not match what he heard when Lena opened the door with a laptop under one arm. He apologized with his eyes. He still had to write the warning. From that point on, the pattern became harder to ignore. A city inspector appeared to follow up on a report about possible code violations. He measured the height of the front steps, the railing, the distance from the porch to the sidewalk. He looked at the peeling paint like it was a crime. He mentioned fines and compliance timelines. The inspector did not appear on any of the other porches that were also peeling. An email circulated about overflow parking on the corner with photographs attached. The car in the picture was Lena's, taken from an angle low enough to make it look like it blocked more sidewalk than it did. The sender suggested that we should gently remind certain households about the standards we all agreed on. The standards had never been put to a vote. Then came the offer. Not on fancy letterhead this time, but in the shape of a man standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and a look of concern arranged carefully on his face. He was not a member of the NIC officially, just someone who lived nearby and worked in real estate. He told the sisters the market was changing fast. He told them they were sitting on a gold mine. He hinted that, in a year or two, Property taxes might go up beyond what some people could comfortably afford. What he really said in the spaces between his words was this: "Sell now before we make it impossible for you to stay." He spoke mostly to Hannah. He looked at her when he mentioned how complicated co-ownership could become. He wondered aloud whether she had thought about protecting her equity and making sure things are clean on paper. He almost never turned his body fully toward Lena, as if she were an assistant in her own kitchen. The implication was there, crude and clear. You could stay if you weren't tied to her. You could be our version of this story, the one where a young professional takes over the charming old house, and the rest gets quietly edited out. He left a card on the counter with a number and a handwritten note. "Happy to help you navigate this." The sisters stared at it after the door closed. The fight, when it finally came, did not begin with a scream. It began with a meeting notice, printed and digital, sent by NIC, titled "Special Session on Property Use and Occupancy." The subject line carried a phrase that turned Lena's stomach: "Protecting our neighborhood." In the body of the email, hidden among bullet points about short-term rentals and parking, was one line that made their plan plain. They proposed a neighborhood compact that would strongly encourage every parcel to designate a single primary owner of record, with any additional adult residents clarified as tenants or guests. It was presented as a way to simplify communication and avoid confusion with the city. For a block that had never cared about confusion when 3 unrelated roommates shared a house, or when a landlord lived out of state, this sudden obsession with clarity felt surgical. Someone wanted to split the sisters on paper. They could not change the deed at the county office, but they could build a second, unofficial map, one where only one of the sisters was counted as the face of the house in every email, every committee, every whisper. One where the other became, again, an afterthought. The meeting was set for a Thursday evening in the church basement at the end of the street. The sisters spent the days before it not just angry, but strategic. Their father had been stubborn about many things. One of them was documentation. He had kept copies of everything: the deed, the insurance policies, the property tax receipts, the correspondence with the bank that had once tried to refuse him a refinance and then changed its tune when he showed them a lawyer's letterhead. He had also, in a folder near the back, kept something else. The first letter his own mother had received, telling her she could finally buy outside the neighborhood lines that had hemmed her in for decades. He knew, long before they did, that paper could be weapon and shield. Lena pulled the folder from the fireproof box in the hall closet. Hannah scanned everything into crisp PDFs and printed extra copies. They made a binder so thick it barely closed. Then, because they had learned from watching men like Langley in other stories, they did something else. They started recording. Not secretly, not at first. Hannah asked a lawyer friend what the rules were in their state. "One-party consent," he said. "Perfectly legal to capture any conversation you were part of." She ordered a small audio recorder and a clip-on phone mount. Then she did what the NIC chair had not expected. She asked to be added to the meeting agenda. The email she sent was polite and direct. She wrote that she and her sister would like time to speak about the proposed neighborhood compact and its impact on co-owners, multiracial families, and long-term residents. She used the words equity and fair housing law in the same paragraph. Sometimes the right nouns were sharper than insults. The chair replied with a single sentence confirming they would have a few minutes after the main items. The phrase "a few minutes" did not bother the sisters as much as the closing. "Hope we can all stay neighborly." It read like a velvet glove. They knew what usually sat beneath gloves. The basement smelled like coffee and floor cleaner the night of the meeting. Folding chairs arranged in rows. A long table at the front with a plastic pitcher of water and an agenda printed in a font that tried too hard to look friendly. Around 30 people turned up. Enough to feel like a crowd, not enough to drown out tension. The sisters sat together in the second row, binder on Lena's lap, Hannah's phone quietly recording from her bag. The first part of the meeting ran like theater. The NIC chair talked about trash pickup and graffiti. A man in a fleece vest complained about a scooter left on the sidewalk last week. Someone passed around a sign-up sheet for a block party. Then they got to the compact. The chair presented it like a formality, a way to standardize how the neighborhood communicated, a way to align with the city. She did not mention the sisters' names, but she did refer to recent situations that reminded us how confusing joint ownership can be for everyone. The room hummed with low, polite agreement. Nobody wanted confusion. When she asked if anyone had comments, she did not look in Lena and Hannah's direction. They stood anyway. Lena spoke first. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Decades of living in black skin had taught her how to pack steel into measured tone. She explained that the house on the corner had been owned outright by her father since before many of the newer residents had moved in. She explained that the deed listed both sisters as equal owners, not primary and secondary, not owner and tenant. She did not tell them the story of every loan he had been denied. She did not tell them about the note slipped under the door the first year he moved in, or the way children had thrown rocks at his windows in the 80s. Some details she kept. She did tell them this. Any compact that required her and her sister to choose which of them counted more on paper was not a neighborly tool. It was an attempt to redraw a line that had already been erased in the county records. Hannah picked up the thread. She talked about what it meant to grow up knowing you had a sister across town that people hesitated to mention. About holiday photos where someone was always cropped out to keep things simple. She talked about how this house was the one place their father had managed to put their names side by side without someone trying to split them into separate stories. She said that asking them to label one as owner and the other as resident did not feel like organization. It felt like history repeating itself with nicer stationery. She mentioned calmly that the Fair Housing Act did not look kindly on policies that disproportionately affected certain families, especially when those policies were not applied evenly across all properties. She noted which houses had 3 unrelated adults on the mailbox and no questions asked. She did not need to accuse the NIC chair of racism outright. The pattern was doing that on its own. Then, without changing her tone, she said one more thing. She said that before this meeting, they had consulted a housing rights clinic. That clinic had been very interested in hearing about the compact. They had words for it: disparate impact, constructive discrimination, hostile housing environment. They had also been very interested in the series of complaints and inspections aimed at one particular address. A few heads turned, almost involuntarily, toward the corner of the room where the NIC chair sat. The meeting could have gone one of two ways then. It could have turned defensive, ugly, open. Somebody could have said the quiet part out loud. Instead, it did what so many neighborhood conflicts do. It tried to retreat into procedure. A man who had lived on the block for 15 years raised his hand. He reminded everyone that the compact was voluntary. Maybe, he suggested, they should take more time and get more feedback before adopting anything official. He did not say that he had been the one quietly mowing Mr. Ward's front strip when his arthritis got bad. He did not say what he had seen in the early 80s when the first wave of gentrifiers came through. He did not need to. People who knew, knew. Another neighbor, an older woman who had watched Lena ride a bike with two small wheels up and down the same sidewalk, asked whether the compact language should be reviewed by an actual attorney if it was meant to align with the city. The NIC chair's face tightened at the edges. The vote, when it came, was not about the sisters alone. It was about whether the NIC would push the compact forward as planned. Hands rose, hesitant but visible. The no votes outnumbered the yes by enough to matter. The compact was tabled indefinitely. On the surface, that felt like a win. Underneath, the neighborhood simply changed tactics. The NIC could not split the sisters with forms. So the streets tried to split them with strain. Sometimes it was tiny things. A package left on the porch that had clearly been opened and taped clumsily shut, addressed only to Hannah. A comment at the coffee shop about how nice it must be for her to have escaped whatever neighborhood she came from, dropped with a glance that slid past Lena as if she were furniture. Sometimes it was heavier, a note anonymous enough to be cowardly, specific enough to hurt. One evening, they found an envelope with no return address in the mail slot. Inside, printed words arranged to sound like concern. It suggested that, for her own financial security, Hannah should consider whether joint ownership is really in her best interest, given the long-term risks. It mentioned stories about families torn apart over property, as if predicting a future it was simultaneously trying to create. Lena watched Hannah read it at the table, jaw tightening. The letter did something the NIC had not quite managed to do in the basement. It put a picture in Hannah's head. Not because she believed the neighborhood had her best interest at heart. She did not. She knew, painfully well, that she was being pulled like rope between two histories she had never asked for, but because she also knew how money and blood could mix into something corrosive. She had seen what it looked like when relatives fought over smaller things than a mortgage-free Victorian on a block that real estate blogs were beginning to notice. The questions that woke her at night had nothing to do with the NIC's careful phrases and everything to do with fear. What if we lose the house because the block decides to make it unlivable? What if taxes spike? What if I'm the one who pulls us under because I make less? Because I don't have as much saved? Because I still owe on my student loans? Those were not theoretical worries. They were numbers on spreadsheets she checked more often than she admitted. The sisters argued, quietly at first, then louder, about whether to sell, whether to rent, whether to move. In those fights, the neighborhood got what it wanted: distance. It did not last. The turning point came unexpectedly, not from another memo or complaint, but from a history project. A local grad student had been working on a dissertation about housing segregation in the city. She had interviewed elders, pored through property records, traced redlining maps. Somehow, Through a chain of contacts that included an old professor and a neighbor's niece, she heard about the Ward house and the sisters' situation. She asked if she could look at their father's papers. Lena hesitated. The documents were more than paper. They were the bones of their family's story. But the student spoke with the careful respect of someone who understood what asking meant. She offered to scan everything, to give them copies, to keep their names out of anything public if they wished. They said yes, with conditions. The student came over one Saturday with a portable scanner and a thermos of tea. They sat around the dining room table while she pulled layers of history from the folder. Old bank letters that used phrases like, "not a suitable candidate at this time." Handwritten notes from a community credit union that had helped their father assemble enough for the initial payment when nobody else would. Property tax assessments that rose sharply the year the first coffee shop opened. In between, notes from Lena's childhood, report cards, school photos, a program from a play where she'd been a tree in the back row. Evidence that the house had been more than an investment to their father. It had been a bet on a future where his daughters would not have to be told which parts of the city were for them. The student's eyes widened over certain documents. She asked if she could, with names changed, use some of the story in a public talk her department was hosting on race, inheritance, and the new color line in housing. It would be open to the community. People from the neighborhood sometimes came when they thought it might affect their property values. The sisters looked at each other. They had been playing defense for months, reacting to what the NIC threw at them. This felt like a chance to flip something, not just to defend, but to define. They agreed, again with conditions. No exact address, no last names, no photographs. The talk took place 3 weeks later in a lecture hall with bad acoustics and good intentions. On the screen at the front, the student projected maps, charts, photos of protest signs from the 60s, mortgage maps from the 70s, glossy real estate ads from the present. Then she told a story about a house on a corner, inherited by 2 sisters, one black, one white, living side by side in a neighborhood that could not decide which century it wanted to belong to. She talked about the unofficial rules people wrote when the official ones changed, about how homeowners' groups and neighborhood councils had become the new walls around certain blocks, about the subtle ways pressure worked, memos, inspections, compacts, the weaponizing of clarity. She did not say Nick. She did not say the name of the street. People in the audience recognized it anyway. They sat in rows, some shifting in their seats, some crossing their arms, some staring straight ahead at the slide that showed a generic Victorian, much like the one on the corner. The story did something the binder and the basement speech had not fully managed to do. It turned what was happening on their block from a private disagreement into a chapter in something much larger. Nobody in that room wanted to be the villain in a lecture about modern segregation. Nobody wanted their association's emails to be quoted on a panel about micro-level housing discrimination. Fear, redirected, can be a tool. A week later, the NIC quietly shelved not just the compact, but several other standardization proposals that had been sitting in draft. A month later, an email went out with a new tone. It announced the formation of a neighborhood justice working group to review how our practices affect all residents, including multiracial families and long-term homeowners. The language was awkward, but the pivot was real. The group would be open to any resident. Lena and Hannah joined. Not because they believed the NIC had suddenly seen the light, but because they knew that power, once challenged, either dug in or mutated. They preferred to watch the mutation up close. Sitting at card tables in church basements and living rooms, they listened as neighbors tried on new words for old habits: bias, inclusion, harm. Some stumbled, some rolled their eyes, some quietly confessed that the memos and complaints had always made them uncomfortable, but they had not known how to say so. The sisters brought their binder. Not every page, not every wound. Enough to make it clear that what had felt like policy from inside the NIC emails had landed as something much sharper on their porch. Some nights, after those meetings, Hannah still paced the kitchen, thinking about the letter that had told her to protect herself. The fear did not vanish just because the neighborhood had started saying nicer words. It simply lived alongside a different clarity. She understood now that protection was not what the letter had offered. It had offered a choice between belonging and blood, between a seat at the block's table and the sister on the other side of the hallway. She knew which side of the line she was standing on. The knowing did not make the practical worries evaporate. It did make them feel shared. The house itself, oblivious to the language shifting around it, continued doing what houses do. It leaked in heavy rain. It soaked up afternoon light in the front room where Lena worked, and Hannah sometimes painted when she could not find words for what she felt. It creaked at 3 a.m. in ways that made both sisters think of their father pacing the hall when they were young and asleep in different zip codes. Years later, when the street looked different again, more trees, fewer for sale signs, a new bus line that made realtors nervous, the house would still be there. Its porch would hold different chairs. Its rooms would hold different furniture. But the deed would still say what it had said on the day the county clerk filed it after the funeral. Both names side by side. The neighborhood had tried, in its careful, coded ways, to split the inheritance along the same old line that had cut through the city for generations. It had failed, not because it suddenly became kind, but because two women refused to let their story be edited quietly in the margins. There is a photograph on the mantel in that house, tucked between an old jazz album and a plant that stubbornly refuses to die. In it, the sisters are on the front steps, feet side by side on the cracked concrete just like the first day. The camera caught them mid-laughter, leaning into each other so closely that, for a moment, their different skin tones read less like contrast and more like what they were. Two parts of the same history, determined not to be separated, no matter how the neighborhood tried to cut the house and them in two.